This video will accompany your notes in the Microeconomics class for Chapter 4, Prices, Free, Controlled, and Relative. You know, we've been studying the laws of supply and demand in earlier chapters, and sometimes that system of free markets, of the interaction of supply and demand, is referred to as a price system. Prices are very important. They serve multiple purposes. One of those is as a rationing device. It's a means for determining who gets the goods and resources available in the economy. As price of a good goes up, for instance, it may signal that there's greater demand for that product. It may also signal higher prices of inputs. But anyway, some people will decide as prices go up that it's just not worth it. They might have been ready to buy a product earlier, but with higher prices they're not going to. And so goods end up in that kind of a system in the hands of those who are willing and able to pay the higher prices. Now, we might ask, especially in a climate where income inequality is so often discussed among politicians and some others, is it fair that wealthy people can afford and therefore obtain more goods than poor people? Is there any rationing device that's fair to everyone? Well, one of the things we have to at least appreciate about prices as a rationing device is that as opposed to a rationing device, for instance, where we might allocate goods based on someone's need or who you know or first come, first serve, is that price has this in its favor, that it rewards those who supply the goods and services that society wants. In other words, I well know that I know of a man who's younger than I am, far younger than I am, and yet is making well in excess of $300,000 a year. That's not anywhere close to what I'm making. And I might begrudge that. I wish I could, make that much money, but I have to admit that that person, in this case it's a medical doctor, has sacrificed a lot in going to school and foregoing income, and is actually pursuing a career that's going to be much more demanding of him than mine is. And I've made different choices than he has, and I'll very freely say that he is providing a service to society that's more valuable, more scarce. In other words, it's worth more in the marketplace. And we might not like to admit that, but the truth is, if in broad terms at least, in general terms, that those who are able to command higher wages in the market are able to do so because they are providing a service that society values more than it does some other services. That doesn't mean that a person who earns less money is less a human being in God's sight than someone else is, but it does mean that they are providing something that society values more. And if I want to earn higher wages, I'll have to turn my attentions to doing something that society values more than what I'm currently doing. More about that maybe later on, but right now let's move on. Prices of goods, serve two critical purposes. One of the issues that I've dealt with over the years and interested in is price gouging. Very often when a state of emergency is declared, for instance in the state of Alabama, Georgia, Florida, like a hurricane comes through or tornadoes, the state attorney general, actually the governor, will declare a state of emergency, and there are laws that prevent people from charging higher prices for certain goods once a state of emergency has been declared. And the notion is that in times of emergency, people ought not to be able to take advantage of those that are in need. Typically speaking, if you've got shortages or you've got high demand, prices would go up, and it's the way that the market tends to help to ration goods. Otherwise, people might simply, the shelves of stores might be cleaned out if in fact prices aren't adjusted upward to reflect the increased demand and the potentially limited supply of those goods. But for some reason, the politicians think they know better and will declare a state of emergency. Then the attorney general of that state will send out warnings about people about potential for price gouging, and asking the citizenry to take note of those businesses that increase their prices, say by more than 10% of the pre-emergency period. That's a nice idea maybe, but the problem with that is that there is no incentive then for people to consume less. there is no incentive for someone else outside the area maybe to take the special effort or engage in the special, let's say incur maybe special dangers or risks of buying those items that are needed and bringing them into those areas there. After a disaster, allocation based on price encourages people to supply generators and water and batteries and other types of things that might be in short supply in periods of calamity, by rewarding those who respond to the need, technically the want. Is that accomplished by allocation based on need or physical strength, the first come, first served, or whatever? That is, that allocation by price and allowing prices to adjust to the changing supply and demand is the way to resolve those, the way to best resolve those shortages. Whereas keeping prices or trying to enforce pre-disaster price levels will in fact discourage people from creating or bringing in the supply that actually resolves the problem. Price gouging laws tend to actually perpetuate and prolong shortages rather than to resolve them. Another thing that prices do is the prices send signals about what society and the market wants. Rising prices signal that demand is increasing relative to supply. Falling prices signal just the opposite. Suppliers in pursuit of profits make decisions about what to produce based on these signals. That is, if they see the price of a particular good going up, they will make decisions to allocate more resources to producing and supplying that good. And so markets are the most effective tool for responding to what markets want in good times and in bad. So anyway, it's important when we, as we will see very soon, when government intervenes for sometimes well-meaning reasons and interferes with prices by either establishing ceilings or price floors, price ceilings below the market clearing price or price floors above the market clearing price, then what it will do is result in shortages or surpluses of the goods in question. Consider the supply and demand curves to introduce the notion of consumer and producer surplus. I'm afraid my something got out of whack here a little bit, but here's your supply curve. Here's the upward sloping again, because suppliers of a good focused on profit will be willing to supply more of those goods, more of any good, at higher prices than at low prices. There's another reason that the supply curve is upward sloping. We'll deal with that again later on. The demand curve is downward sloping because primarily of diminishing marginal utility. That is, that first ice cream cone is really good, that second one not good but not as good, and so on. So a downward sloping supply curve says that all in all, the market is willing to pay to consume more goods at lower prices, to demand more goods at lower prices than at higher prices. Well, the interaction of supply and demand, as we see here, results in an intersection of supply and demand where we have essentially an equilibrium point. At this particular point, and unfortunately this is not the chart I had in mind, but imagine this is price here, the equilibrium price, and down here this point designates equilibrium quantity. And at that particular quantity supplied equals quantity demanded at that particular price, and the market is said to clear. There's nobody whining on the sidelines, as I like to say. Well, anyway, let's look at this. What we find here is, for instance, if you think about this demand curve, there are people who would have been willing for lesser quantities or certain quantities of this good to pay higher prices. In other words, for lower quantities here, there would be a price corresponding to that way up here. And again, for instance here, if this were the market price, there would be a number of people willing to buy those goods. Not as many as will buy at the market price. But again, and this triangle here basically represents, because all these people that are buying are actually buying at the market price, in this case of $290 That not supposed to be in this example, but it's in the next one. But anyway, at this particular price, the market quantity supplied equals quantity demanded, the market clears. Well, actually, because the number of people would have been willing to pay quite a bit more than they had to pay, designated by this line here, this section here, this graph represents what we call consumer surplus. It is the, let's say, the advantage. It's the value that consumers realize by virtue of their participation in a market. They were able to buy at market prices. They didn't negotiate these, separately. Very recently, because my wife and I are moving this summer, we're trying to get our house ready to sell, and so I've had a painting contractor come in, and I told him what I wanted done. I don't have the time to do it myself, so I had Don Whittington come in, and he gave me a quote on it, and frankly, it was quite a bit less than I was expecting it to be. That was where it hit home. That's consumer surplus. I would have been willing to pay more, but he didn't know that, and he was bidding it based on his experience in all his other jobs. In other words, he gave me what he thought was a good market quote, and I was happy to get that. And so I realized consumer surplus because I might have been willing to pay this much more than I actually ended up paying. Well, actually the same thing goes for producers, because notice some producers would be willing to supply goods at a price way down here. But all these producers here, by engaging in the market, are able to sell their goods. I think I might have said buy, but to sell. They would have been selling their goods, some goods down here, but they're able to sell at this price here. And so given that some of those producers would have been willing to accept lower prices, they benefit by this amount. That is, the area that is designated by this triangle is what we call producer surplus. And so what this all says here is that in fact both consumers and producers of goods benefit from participating in a market. Now we're going to take this notion of consumer and producer surplus, we're going to see it again pretty quickly. What we're going to do is see what this understanding, this notion of consumer and producer surplus, tell us about the effects of price controls, government price controls, some that represent price floors, that is where the government is setting a minimum price at which a good can change hands, and some we'll also look at the examples of a price ceiling, which establishes a maximum price at which goods can change hands. First of all, we'll look at a price floor. That'll be for the next video.